What happens when a millionaire CEO walks into his own diner, orders a simple meal, and uncovers a reality far worse than he ever imagined? Ethan Cole had built his diner chain with the belief that happy employees create the best customer experiences. But lately, something wasn't right. Reports of declining profits, high employee turnover, and growing customer complaints pointed to a deeper problem. One his district manager brushed off as just a rough patch. Ethan wasn't convinced. If things were fine, why were longtime staff members quitting without explanation? Why were customers walking away dissatisfied? The only way to find out the truth was to see it himself. So he dressed down, left his executive title behind, and walked into one of his struggling diners as just another customer. What he expected were small inefficiencies, maybe a slow kitchen, a tired-looking team, or a manager cutting corners. But what he witnessed instead left him frozen in his seat. A young cook in the kitchen was holding back tears, struggling to keep up as the manager barked orders at her without mercy. And just as Ethan lifted his fork to take the first bite of his meal, he heard something that made his stomach turn, a muffled sob from behind the kitchen doors. Something was terribly wrong, and he wasn't leaving until he found out exactly what. Ethan knew that walking into the diner as himself, a well-groomed CEO in a tailored suit, would change the way people behaved. If something was truly wrong, employees would put on a performance the moment they recognized him. To see the real picture, he had to become invisible. He dressed the part, a worn hoodie, faded jeans, and a scruffy beard that made him look nothing like the polished executive seen in business magazines. He traded his expensive watch for a simple one, put on an old baseball cap, and wore thick-rimmed glasses to further disguise himself. Looking in the mirror before leaving, he barely recognized himself. That was exactly what he needed. Choosing the right location was key. He picked a small suburban diner, one of the lowest performing in his chain, where the staff had never met him in person. It was far from corporate office, and most employees only knew him as a name on their paychecks. If things were as bad as the report suggested, no one would suspect him as anything more than an ordinary customer. The moment he stepped inside, the atmosphere felt heavy. The first thing he noticed was a lack of energy. Diners were meant to feel warm and welcoming, but this place felt dull and exhausted. The servers moved mechanically, their smiles forced. The cashier barely acknowledged the customers walking in. A group of customers near the entrance muttered complaints under their breath, eyeing their watches as they waited for their food. His eyes moved to the far corner, where a middle-aged man with a stained uniform sat slouched in a chair, scrolling through his phone. It was clear from the way the other employees avoided him. This was the manager, but instead of keeping things in order, he didn't seem to care at all. Ethan took a slow breath and walked toward an empty booth. No one greeted him. No warm welcome. No eye contact. He slid into his seat and observed the diner around him, already sensing that the reports hadn't even scratched the surface. Something was definitely wrong, and he was about to find out just how deep the problem went. Ethan picked up the menu, though he wasn't really looking at it. His focus was on the staff, their body language, and how the diner functioned under pressure. He flagged down a waitress, who seemed just as tired as the rest of the team, and ordered a simple meal, a classic cheeseburger, fries, and coffee. As he waited, he turned his attention toward the kitchen. Behind the counter, a single cook, Lily, a young woman in her mid-20s, was working at a frantic pace. Her uniform was slightly wrinkled, her face flushed from the heat, and she moved with the kind of exhaustion that made every motion feel heavier. She flipped patties, assembled plates, and checked the fryer, all alone. Ethan scanned the diner. There was no one helping her. Instead, the manager, Ron, stood with his arms crossed, barking orders at Lily like a drill sergeant. Faster. We're backed up. That order should have been out already. Not once did he offer to help. Not once did he grab a plate or check on customers. He just stood there, watching, demanding, but doing nothing. Lily, already overwhelmed, just nodded silently and worked harder, her hands moving faster even though she was clearly struggling. Then a loud crash. A plate slipped from her hands, shattering on the floor. The diner went momentarily silent, a few customers glancing toward the kitchen at the sudden noise. Ron's reaction was instant. "Damn it, Lily. How hard is it to keep it together?" His voice cut through the restaurant like a blade. Lily froze. For the first time since Ethan walked in, he saw her hesitate. She quickly bent down to pick up the broken pieces, her fingers trembling slightly. But before she could finish, she turned her head away, her shoulders shaking just enough for Ethan to notice. Then faintly he heard it, soft, muffled. She was crying. Ethan clenched his jaw. He had come here expecting mismanagement, maybe laziness. But this was something else. And he had no intention of sitting by and watching any longer. Ethan slowly slid out of his booth, his coffee untouched, his meal forgotten. He walked toward the counter, keeping his movements casual, pretending to stretch as he took a step closer to the kitchen. Lily was still on the floor, hurriedly picking up shards of broken plate, her hands slightly shaking. She didn't look up. The tension in her slumped shoulders told Ethan everything. Then he heard her voice, soft, exhausted, and on the verge of breaking. "I haven't eaten all day. I just need a minute." Her words barely made it past her lips, but they hit Ethan like a punch to the gut. Ron didn't even hesitate. "You don't get paid to complain," he shot back, his tone sharp and dismissive. "If you can't handle it, quit." Ethan felt his fingers curl into fists. It wasn't just the words, it was the way Ron said them. Like Lily was nothing. Like she was replaceable, just another worker to push to the limit and throw away when she burned out. No sympathy, no concern, just cold indifference. Lily stayed silent, quickly wiping at her face with the back of her sleeve before reaching for a rag to clean the mess. Ethan had seen enough. He had walked in as a silent observer, prepared to collect information before making any decisions. But now he wasn't just here to watch. He was here to do something about it. Ethan didn't hesitate. He pushed open the swinging kitchen door and stepped inside, his presence demanding attention. The air was thick with the smell of sizzling oil and grill meat, but all he could focus on was a look of exhaustion on Lily's face and the smug, uncaring stance of Ron standing above her. Ron barely glanced up before stepping in front of Ethan, arms crossed, his expression irritated. "Customers aren't allowed back here," he said flatly, barely looking away from his phone screen. Ethan let out a short, humorless laugh, shaking his head. Then he met Ron's gaze, his voice calm but razor-sharp. "That's funny," he said, slipping his hands into his pockets, "because I own this place." The kitchen went silent. Lily froze mid-motion, her eyes going wide. A young dishwasher in the back stopped scrubbing plates, staring at Ethan like he had just announced a government raid. Even the line cook, who had been doing his best to ignore the tension, slowly turned to see what would happen next. Ron's smirk disappeared, his face drained of color, and for the first time, he looked genuinely thrown off. "You're what?" he stammered, blinking as if hoping he had misheard. Ethan took a slow step forward, lowering his voice just enough to make it clear he wasn't here to play games. "I said, I own this place." He let the word sink in before adding, "And I think it's about time we had a little talk." Ron swallowed hard, and in that moment, everyone in the kitchen knew things were about to change. The tension in the kitchen was thick enough to cut with a knife. Ron's usual arrogance vanished as he stared at Ethan, his face draining of color. I didn't realize," Ron stammered, his previous confidence crumbling in an instant. "You didn't realize?" Ethan's voice was calm but ice-cold. He took a slow step forward, his piercing gaze locked onto Ron. You mean to tell me that you didn't realize you've been running my business into the ground? Ron opened his mouth to defend himself, but before he could come up with an excuse, a waitress, who had been listening from the doorway, spoke up. "It's true," she said quickly, looking at Ethan. "He cuts our hours without warning, and then forces us to work double shifts when it's inconvenient for him." Another voice chimed in, a busboy from corner. "He refuses to give breaks, even when it's not that busy. If you ask, he threatens to cut your hours." A young server near the prep station hesitated before adding, "And if we make a mistake or a customer complains, he humiliates us in front of everyone." Ethan's jaw tightened. He scanned the room, taking in the exhausted faces of his employees. Faces filled with frustration, exhaustion, and quiet resentment. These weren't people who were just having a rough day. These were people who had been working under fear and mistreatment for far too long. Then Lily finally spoke. Her voice was soft, but it carried the weight of exhaustion. She wiped her hands on a rag, her movement slow as if every muscle in her body ached. "I've been working 12-hour shifts," she said, her eyes flickering toward Ron for just a second before looking back at Ethan. "No breaks. No real time to eat. If I slow down, I get yelled at. If I ask for help, I get told to just push through it." She swallowed hard before adding, "I don't even know if I can keep doing this anymore." Ethan let out a slow breath, his patience gone. He turned back to Ron, his voice deadly quiet. "This is how you've been running my diner?" Ron had no answer, but Ethan did. And Ron wasn't going to like what was coming next. The silence in the kitchen was deafening. Every employee stood frozen, eyes shifting between Ethan and Ron, waiting for what would happen next. Ethan took a slow breath, his patience officially gone. He had seen enough. "You're done." His voice was sharp, unwavering. "Pack your things and leave. You're fired." Ron blinked, his face twisting in disbelief. "Wait, what? You can't." "I can." Ethan cut him off, his tone final. "And I just did." Ron's mouth opened and closed, scrambling for an argument, but there was none. He had pushed too far, and now he was paying the price. His gaze flickered to the other employees, expecting someone to defend him, but no one did. Instead, Lily let out a shaky breath, her shoulders visibly relaxing. The servers exchanged nervous but hopeful glances. The dishwasher in the back finally looked up from his station, relief flashing in his eyes. Ron let out a sharp scoff, shaking his head in frustration. "Fine," he muttered, grabbing his things. He turned back, his expression twisted with resentment. "Good luck running this place without me." Ethan didn't even flinch. "Trust me," he said coolly. "It'll be just fine." Ron shoved open the kitchen door, storming out. As soon as he was gone, the entire room seemed to exhale. The weight that had been pressing down on the staff lifted in an instant. Ethan turned to Lily, his expression softening. "You don't deserve this," he said. "Take the rest of the day off. Paid." Lily's eyes widened. "Wait, really?" Ethan nodded. "Yes. No more 12-hour shifts. No more being treated like garbage. Things are going to change around here." For the first time since he arrived, Lily smiled. It was small, hesitant, like she wasn't used to kindness, but it was real. "Thank you," she whispered. Ethan turned to the rest of the staff. "I know things have been rough," he admitted, "and I should have seen it sooner. But I see it now. This diner, this company, doesn't run without you, and from today forward, you will be treated with the respect you deserve." The employees exchanged glances, the disbelief clear on their faces. They had spent so long under Ron's rule that the idea of real change felt unbelievable. But looking at Ethan now, asterisk, not as some distant CEO, but as someone who had just stepped in and stood up for them, asterisk, they believed him. For the first time in a long time, hope returned to the diner. The next morning, Ethan arrived at the diner not as an undercover customer, but as the owner ready to rebuild. The tension that had once filled the space was lighter, but there was still uncertainty in the air. The staff had spent months working under Ron's toxic leadership. Change felt too good to be true. Ethan wasted no time. Standing in the center of the kitchen, he looked at the team that had stuck through exhausting shifts, unfair treatment, and endless stress. They deserve better. Starting today, things are going to be different. His voice was steady, carrying the weight of a promise. He turned to Carlos, a seasoned line cook who had been with the diner for years. Carlos had never spoken up the way Lily had, but Ethan had noticed the way he kept the kitchen running even when Ron refused to step in. "Carlos, you're the interim manager now." Carlos stared at him, wide-eyed. "Me?" Ethan nodded. "You know this place better than anyone, and I trust you to help fix what's broken. But this time, we do it the right way, with respect for the team." Carlos took a deep breath, nodding. "I won't let you down." That was the first step. Next, Ethan made a call to corporate HR. The diner was understaffed, and that was going to change. He authorized immediate hires to relieve the overworked team. No more double shifts without help. No more understaffed lunch rushes. Then came the biggest shift. Pay increases. "I've looked at the numbers," Ethan said, "and there's no excuse for what you've been paid. Effective immediately, wages are going up, and no one works a full shift without proper breaks." The room was silent at first. Then the realization sank in. Lily blinked in shock. "You mean we won't have a fight for time to eat?" Ethan shook his head. "No, you won't. You're not machines, you're people. And this business doesn't work without you." For the first time in a long time, the diner didn't feel like a place of exhaustion. It felt like hope. Customers noticed a difference almost immediately. The energy changed. The server smiled genuinely, not just out of obligation. Orders came out faster because the kitchen staff wasn't drowning in work. Even the regulars, who had grown used to long wait times and irritated employees, felt the shift. One older customer nudged his wife, whispering, "Something's different today. Feels better, doesn't it?" She smiled, watching as Lily took an order, without looking over her shoulder in fear. Yes, it did feel different. And this was only the beginning. As the day wound down, Ethan stood near the kitchen entrance, watching as his employees moved with newfound ease. There was no longer the heavy tension of exhaustion and fear. The weight that had hung over this diner for months was finally lifting. Lily was at the counter, chatting lightly with a server as she played an order, no longer rushing to meet impossible demands. Carlos, now the interim manager, gave instructions with patience and respect, rather than barking orders like Ron once did. Even the new hires, still learning the ropes, seemed relieved to be part of a team that actually cared. Ethan took a slow breath, feeling a sense of satisfaction he hadn't felt in years. He had come here expecting bad management. He had uncovered something far worse, and now he had set things right. But he also knew that this wasn't just about one diner. This wasn't just about Ron's toxic leadership. This was about his company, his people. He had trusted spreadsheets, reports, and second-hand accounts for far too long, believing that as long as the numbers looked good, the business was thriving. But numbers couldn't show the exhaustion on Lily's face. Numbers couldn't capture the defeat in his employees' voices. If he had never stepped foot in this diner, how long would this have gone on? How many other locations were struggling under silent suffering, hidden behind corporate reassurances? Ethan made a silent promise to himself. Never again. No more blind trust in reports. No more distance from the people who built his business. From now on, he will be present. He would listen, not just to his managers, but to his employees. He would make sure that every single location carried the same values he had built his company on. Straightening his jacket, he walked toward the front door. Before stepping outside, he turned back to his team. "Thank you." His voice was genuine, steady. "For everything you do. This business wouldn't exist without you." Lily and the others exchanged glances, as if waiting for a catch. For so long, they had been treated as replaceable. But this time, they saw something different in Ethan's eyes. He meant it. As Ethan stepped into the cool evening air and walked toward his car, he didn't feel like a CEO walking away from a business. He felt like a leader finally doing what he was meant to do. And this was only the beginning.